Welcome, guys. Today we're going to cover mixed strategies in position. So we're going to cover obviously how to cbet flops and also how that changes things on the turns and rivers. So basically, first off, when do we mix our strategy? Okay, there's a couple of reasons for us to mix our strategy. First off, stack depth. Okay, in this sim, it's just 100 big blinds. But especially when you play deeper stacks, mixed strategies become more important. If let's say you c-bet on a board like this, ace 10 9. At the 100 big blinds, you'll almost only see bets large. Maybe like 10% of your bets are small of the total bets, right? So if this is 52%, of that, maybe 10% would be a small bet, maybe even less. When you get to deeper stacks, it will bet less, even small, right? Because we've got we've got nines, we've got tens, we've got aces 100% of the time. Villain never does, and it's very important to leverage that advantage and try and get as much value as we possibly can. So when stacks get deeper, betting large makes more sense. Now, when stacks get more shallow, the opposite happens. So at 100 big blinds, it's like this, but at 40 big blinds, we actually start c-betting a little bit towards the smaller side, right? Because if we were to bet small, bet big, you can get in 40, 50 big blinds pretty easily. You just can't get in the remaining 50 or more. So number one is the stack depth, and then also we look at the connectivity of the board. So ask yourself, how many overcards are out there? How many straight draws? Are they open-enders? Are they gut shots? Do you have overcards? Well, I already said that. Flush draws, all that type of stuff. So if you look at a board like this, ace 10 8, villain should have ace 10, ace 9, 10 9, basically every time, right? He should have queen jack, king queen sometimes, 8 7, jack 8, flush draw. So the point is, villain's range hits his board pretty well. It just hits our board better, our range better. So when it's a strong range versus strong range situation, that's when you want to bet big. If it's strong range versus weak range on a dry board, that tends to be when you want to bet small, right? Anyway, so I've actually pushed this a little bit more. As you can see, the stack is 55, or the pot's 55, and the bet size is actually 60. So Pio actually prefers to slay overbet this board. Now, if you pick 75 or 100 or 110, I don't really care too much. The point is that we absolutely cannot see bet range. If the board were ace 10 9 rainbow, it still would bet big, but not it would not feel the need as much to, right? If the board's like ace 10 7, it moves towards the smaller bet a little bit more, or becomes a bit more aggressive. Is ace 10 6 even more, right? If you have like ace 10 6 rainbow, now we have a different board. So look at the connectivity of the board. Because it's 10 9x, all of the gut shots and straight draws are out there, right? Whereas on 10 6x, not so much. So because of the direct connectivity of the board, the fact that there's 3 relevant cards out there, the big one obviously defends a lot of nines, a lot of tens, a lot of aces. We bet a mixed strategy. And this is how it works, guys. So if you look at, this is how it works. If we look at, let's say, the top 20% of our range, top 25% range, it almost only bets, except for a couple of the top 2% hands. So if you look at the top end of our hands, right, we're almost always betting them. Ace 9, ace 10, ace jack, ace queen, ace king, right? Those are some of the best hands in our range. Obviously, we have hands like 10s, we have 9s, we have ace 10. We have 10 9, right? We're virtually always betting them. Then if you look at the top hand, aces actually gets checked. So basically, if you have a hand which is extremely good, but it also blocks a lot of calls, you would tend to trap sometimes. But with a hand like 10s and 9s, which is obviously very good and doesn't block a lot of the calls being mostly aces over multiple streets, you'll see that it ends up betting a lot. So notice here, the EV of betting here is 133. The EV of betting aces is 116, right? So if you look at imposition EV, you look at imposition EV, you see pocket tens has more EV than pocket aces, even though pocket aces is a better hand than pocket tens. But it doesn't matter because villain never has like pocket tens and a half, right? Pocket tens and pocket aces are the exact same hand, except that pocket tens unblock an ace that gives you a lot of calls, gets you a lot of calls, right? So with the top hands, we tend to bet. If we have a top hand, we tend to sometimes check. Then if you look at the medium value hands, jacks, queens, kings, eights, we tend to mostly check. If you look at hands like a 9, right? 9 8, 9 7, 9 6, they're mostly being checked. If we look at hands like a 10, jack 10, queen 10, they're mostly being checked. So the the better hands get bet, the very strong ones occasionally get checked, and the medium ones tend to get bet not very frequently, unless we have, let's say, good backdoors to go with it. And then if you look at the draws in our range, we look at the high equity draws first, and you'll see hands like Queen Jack, Jack 8, 8-7. They're being bet at a very high frequency, right? Now, if you then look at hands with slightly lower equity, 8-6, 6-7, King Jack, King Queen, you see they're still being bet at a decent frequency, but a much lower one. So basically, the weaker your showdown value and the better your equity, the more of a bet. So let's compare Queen Jack and King Jack, right? Queen Jack only has Queen high, so it loses to King high, and villain has a lot of King highs. At the same time, we have an open ender, not a gut shot, right? So basically, more equity, less showdown value means more betting. Now, if you look at 8-7, well, weaker draw than 8-7, but now 8 high, right? If we turn an 8 or 7 on this board, it's not easy to get the showdown. If we turn a Queen or a Jack, it's much easier, right? So that's where the little showdown comes in. What we'll also sometimes bluff is under pairs to the board. So you see deuces, 3s, and 4s. And you see 82, 77, 74, 67. You keep going up and up and up, and you'll see the frequency decrease, right? So you see the highest under pair in 8s doesn't get bet that frequently, whereas the lowest one definitely does, right? And then if you look at some backdoors, it will end up bluffing them as well. So you see, for instance, a lot of hands like Queen 7. They block hands that call as a draw, like Queen 7, Jack 7, 8-7, whatever. And especially with good backdoors. One thing you also see is that when you have backdoor flush draws or actual flush draws, you'll always bet more often. That doesn't mean you always bet, but you bet more often. Example, 8-7 of diamonds. Queen Jack of diamonds, 97.5% bet. Now we look at the club combo, 98% bet. That's actually the same. But then you look, because it has a backdoor flush draw. But then you look at the spade and hearts combos, and all of a sudden you see 76% bet, right? So you see, okay, those are being bet less often. So remember, more money in the pot, more equity means more money in the pot. So you look at, for instance, Queen Jack, where we cannot have a backdoor flush, like a flush on the turn if we were to hit. We bet a bit less often, right? You see 87% bet versus 77%. And then what you'll also see is that with the diamond, so we look at, well, it was over here, just keep looking there. You see Queen Jack offsuit with the Queen of diamonds, 91% bet. But then if you look at the top left with the spade and with the heart, you see 79% bet, right? So with the backdoors, or even with the club, or with the Jack of diamonds, more betting, okay? And then generally when you have absolutely no equity, as in you have no flush draw, you have no backdoor flush draw either, that's the type of hand who'd end up checking. So for instance, 6-4 suited, right? 6-4 suited has a backdoor, well, one of them has a flush draw, but it has a backdoor gut shot, which is a weak gut shot, right? So on a 7 or 8 run out, in which case villain can easily have a better straight. So you see 6-4 doesn't really get bet much. You see 6-4 with diamonds actually gets checked, 90%, and the other ones get bet even less, right? So basically, when we have absolutely nothing, we tend to end up betting, right? So at least with 4-3, we also really have nothing, but at least our backdoor straight outs are live, right? Whereas if the run out's 5 deuce, we have the nuts. Whereas on an 8-7 run out, we do not. And once again, as I said, like here, 10-6, 10-7, medium strength hands that don't really need protection, those types of hands do not need to be bet. Against this strategy, villain obviously should not be doing a lot of raising. And what you see is that on the good turns for us, we end up betting big again. So you see check. I added a 3/4 pot bet, which is a very common bet size, right? And you see it gets used literally never. So guys, on the flop, our betting frequency is average, right? Somewhere in the low 50s, not super high. So basically we're saying we've got a great hand. And so on the deuce, obviously nothing really changes, which is why we employ this large bet, right? Now, if we were to pick like the 8 of diamonds, you see how now all of a sudden it moves towards a 3/4 pot sizing, right? Because obviously on the 8, villain can have straights, flushes, 2 pairs, pair plus diamond, etc. But back to the deuce of clubs first. So you see a lot of hands get pure bet. You see a lot of hands like these, hands that are very valuable, do get bet. We did bet some of the low aces on the flop sometimes, and they will get checked no matter what. Because one thing that people do wrong a lot is that they bet too polarized on a board like this. And then they just end up betting every single good hand. And then when they check, they always have nothing, right? That's obviously something you want to be careful of. So we would take a hand like ace five offsuit, let's say, we'd sometimes bet the flop, and then we would check any turn but exactly a five, right? Even an ace we'd probably check. So even if the turn were an ace, even if the turn is an ace, as I said right here, you see, even these we would check, even on the best card in the deck. Now, if the turn were, let's say, a five, I imagine we bet ace five, right? So you see always betting. Interesting how we start employing some more 3/4 pop bets on the five, but it's not a huge difference. Question, why is that? So you see on the deuce, okay, let's pick the deuce of hearts. So on the deuce of hearts, right, no second flush. Oh, I mean, only big bet, only huge bet. But then on the five, which seems like a similar card, it still employs the big bet. And I would definitely recommend that you guys use it. But why does it now include the 3/4 bet, which is still a big bet, but not a huge bet? The point is, if you look at our betting range on the flop, right, you see 40% of our ace fives get bet. But then if you look at his calling range, 100% of his get called. So on the five, we're improved a bit more. If you look at my out of position range, I feel that no ace deuces, so the deuce is not relevant. That's why. But still, you clearly do see that the big bet is by far the best. Yeah, it's only because of the ace five. Well, also, I mean, not entirely. It's also 10-5, right? If you look at 10-5 suited here, 10-5 suited actually gets folded a decent amount. But, at least 10-5 also improves, 9-5 improves. So small difference. Also, one more thing. What is the next thing? There's one more. Big points if you get this one. Why else? Why else does it still prefer this size but like this one as well? Why else? Okay, the reason is, look at our pairs. Deuces, 82% bet. 5, 67% bet, right? So we obviously, if you look at our betting range, we're never calling deuces, right? He's not calling deuces, he's not calling fives. But he will call ace five. Right, so basically we have more sets on the deuce than on the five. It's a small difference, but all these little differences cause this, not substantial difference, but it's noteworthy. So imagine, what does it do on the six? On the six is a bit different, right? Because now it's got a straight. So anyway, so we end up on the safe cards, we end up betting. So on the safe cards, we do end up betting, right? It's mostly the same range. We mostly bet like the high equity draws again, and the lower ones not so much. So that's pretty standard. And then against that strategy, we do a little bit of raising as out of position, but not a whole lot, call. And what you see is that on the blank, I mean, obviously we pick kind of a dream run out, right? Check, check. You see that all in is the sizing. We're only shoving for about 110% of the pot. I also allowed I didn't allow a smaller bet, but even if, let's say I picked a five and it does bet 3/4 sometimes, call river deuce. Oops, that's not the right deuce. What you'll now see is big bets as well as small bets, right? It's actually a bit surprising how it mostly uses the big bet. Did I even allow an all-in? I did allow an all-in. Yeah, so that's a little bit surprising, actually. If you pick something like a five, it will probably do something similar where it bets big, but it also goes all in, right? Actually surprising how it doesn't go for it as much. So anyway, we see five, we see deuce, we check, we overbet, we call. And what you see is on a run out like this, we shove extremely aggressively, right? And as you see, we're shoving as thinly as ace check plus because we know villain doesn't have ace queen. We know he probably would have not always... He would sometimes check raise ace 9, ace 10, and 10-9 not gets counterfeit. So you see basically all of the range that's happy overbetting flop and turn is not happily overbetting river, right? So what are the bluffs in our range? We're mostly... Yeah, what are the bluffs in our range? I mean, what we sometimes like the bluff is the low stuff, right? Because the low stuff doesn't block anything. So you do see that these types of hands get bluffed, and basically some of the lower ones do get bluffed. If we have hands like king, queen, king, jack, they don't really get bluffed so much. So that's pretty interesting. Let's now pick a different card. So obviously the scarier the card, the more we want to check, right? So on the deuce of diamonds, you see we end up betting a mostly bet 3/4, sometimes bet small. On, let's say, the 6 of diamonds, we mostly bet big, sometimes bet small. So the 6 of diamonds seems like a scarier card than the deuce of diamonds, right? I think we all agree with that. Why do we bet large more often than on the deuce of diamonds, which is more innocent? One small thing is obviously, again, the pocket deuces advantage, right? But what's the other one? The 6 seems scarier than the deuce. Why do we go bigger on the deuce? On the 6, I'm sorry. Look at villains defending range in the big blind, right? Some of the suited hands are blocked by the board. The fact that there's a 10 over 9 out there, right? Generally what you have is like a high and low flush, or like a mid and low flush, like 9-5, 9-6. But the 6 of diamonds does a great job of blocking a lot of the flushes, whereas the deuce of diamonds does not block many flushes, because villains should not call many flushes on the flop that contain a deuce anyway, right? So basically all the flushes are blocked. So if you look at, let's say, a 5, it would be kind of similar. Right? You see, before it was quite substantial, now a bit less substantial. And then once you move towards an 8, obviously it becomes a bit more scary, because now out of position not only has more flushes are blocked by the board, sure, but now he does have more straights and 2 pairs and whatever. So you see right now, again, 3/4 pot is the play, right? So you see on these connecting cards, you bet 3/4. On the other ones, also 3/4, but it's less dominant. But we do still bet 3/4. We do not overbet anymore, right? We do not overbet anymore, because if you look at out of positions range, Queen Jack's in there. 6-7, I imagine is not really in there that much. It's not really much. It's not in there much, right? But you have hands like Jack 7 sometimes. The main point is Queen Jack. If you look at a lot of the flush draws, right? 7-4, 7-3, 8-4, all that stuff. It's all in there. It's actually interesting how 9-7 hands get folded. Anyway, I think this is an interesting spot, right? So, and the fundamentals of the flop, we're mostly going to discuss the flop, are similar on every single board. So this is how you do it. Obviously, look at the connectivity of the board, presence of the flush draw, the overcards, and then you decide whether or not to use a mixed strategy. And once you do, basically you look at, top few hands, maybe check. Below that, you bet. The middle of the hand and middle range checks, and the bottom range usually checks, unless, let's say, you have good bluffing ability with under pairs or whatever. When it comes to the draws, the higher the equity, the lower the showdown value, the more betting you do. And the same goes for the backdoors, right? If you have prime backdoors, you tend to bet a lot. So if, let's say, we have a hand like Queen 7, your backdoors are pretty good. Let's say Queen 7 of clubs, we bet quite a bit. But then if we look at like a hand like King 5 of clubs, you see we went from 40-something% to 10-something%. Right? So because Queen High with the double backdoor straight draw is better than King High with only one bad backdoor straight draw. Okay, second board. I ran this one fresh last night. So this one is actually 3/4. I actually ran it again with 75 and 100, and actually prefer 75, as in like 2/3 75, 1/3 pot. So I just simplified it to only 75. So we've got the same range, and we see the same thing, right? So one overcard out there. Queen 10 makes an open ender. 10-9 makes an open ender. Flush draws, 2 pairs, because villain is going to defend hands like King 8 off and Jack 8 off and King Queen and all that type of stuff. Pocket 8s. So the point is, it's a very strong board for big blind, and obviously an even stronger board for the button. And the board is very draw heavy, so you want to bet big here. And what you see is, here, slightly higher betting frequency. And we see the same thing, right? We see that, if you look at the strong hands, like Ace King, King Queen, King Jack, King 10 almost always get a bet. King Queen, King 9 a bit less. Well, 6 actually a bit more, but other than that, we go down and down and down and down, right? So basically, the better the kicker, the more you end up betting. Same goes for Queen 10, right? Queen 10, very high frequency bets, 76 and 88%. But then if you looked at a hand like a weaker type of draw, like for instance, Ace 10 off, or maybe let's make it easy, like Queen 9, right? Queen 9 is actually close. But the point is, if you get like a slightly weaker draw, you would actually bet less. So the issue is here, like obviously almost all of your draws are premium draws. So that's why it doesn't matter a whole lot. Let's see. So anyway, we end up betting large, and we check back the medium strength hands, right? So obviously Jack 4, whatever, all the time. And then Jack 10, that type of stuff we mix it up with. And when it comes to the draw, it's the same thing. If you look at nut flush draws, for instance, with the low kicker, we bet a lot, like Ace 4 diamonds, 84% bet. I would imagine that with more showdown value, you'd want to check back flush draws as well. So with ace queen of diamonds, actually not that one. Ace eight then. So actually also not that one. Let me see. Eight seven of diamonds then. Let me see if that one works. A little bit less. Eight six of diamonds. Okay, I actually cannot find a single one. Let me think. 10-8? 10-8. Okay, finally got one. So you see 10-8 is like a flush, a combo draw. So basically you'd also want to check back flush draws, right? You'll see stuff like weaker flush draws again, because the point is, even if you hit your flush, once you're all in, you're probably going to lose, right? So you probably want to just check this one behind and have some flushes in your check back range. We can add a couple of 8x plus flush draw and all the other ones at a lower frequency. So for instance, like, queen 8 suited, you see, right? Queen 8 suited gets checked behind mostly. Let's see, ace 10, a bit less. Ace 9 gets checked sometimes. Ace 8, not so much, not so much, not so much. And these obviously make more sense, right? As like a high frequency bet. So again, we see the same thing. Top range could occasionally check, not so much on this board because protection is more important. The good hands get bet, the middling hands get checked, and then if you have no equity, once again, we pick a hand like 6-4. We see like 6-4 spades. It does apparently get bet sometimes, but not a whole lot, right? Or let's say we pick 4-3 here. I mean, we don't really bet that one at all. I guess we bet 10% of the time if we have the diamond draw. And I guess 4% if we have actually 40% if we have the hearts, but that's about it. Obviously, once again, we see a low frequency check raise. And the same things, right? Like on the turn, you'd see like a big overbet. Whereas if, let's say, the turn is a 9, I would imagine here maybe still overbet. But if you imagine like a 9, you see big bet, right? Because villain can have 10-7. Villain can have jack 9, villain can have jack 8, villain can have king 9, queen 10, all that type of stuff. If you looking at the big bet, you see queen 10 mostly gets check called, right? I mean, that's like what? I mean, it's 75% of the queen 10s do get check called. So on the turn, it's obviously a little bit scary. Whereas back to the deuce, now you see again big bet, right? And you see the same types of things. The high equity draws first and the weak ones second. So let's say big bet, 10-9 gets check raised a decent amount, definitely not always. So let's say call and then an offsuit 7. Oops. So it still bets large just because the 7 is not so relevant anymore. So on the 9 is obviously a lot more relevant than the 7. But still, I mean, it likes both, right? So if you ended up betting 3/4, I wouldn't really hate that. The point is just that the 9 is a lot more scary. You see, I mean, before it was mostly big, sometimes small, like mostly huge, sometimes big. Now it's mostly big and sometimes huge. Because the 7 is less relevant, right? And then if you pick like another card, like for instance an 8, you see now to bet substantially less often, right? Because we see here versus bet 8x is still being called quite often. So on the 8 turn, obviously it's pretty close, big bet or huge bet. I would probably stick to a big bet. You have to ask yourself, like, how relevant is the 8, right? If the 8 is very relevant, check a lot. If it's not so relevant, you can bet a bit more often. So, but obviously we check behind quite a bit. And if the turn is something else, which is scary, let's say the 7 of diamonds, again, we'd be careful, right? You see again. So basically on flush cards, guys, after the polarizing bet, we tend to bet 3/4. You do see that once again, a lot of the flushes are blocked by the board. Same as if we pick like a 6, right? A lot of flushes are blocked by the board. Now, if we pick the deuce, you see how it's, it's still a big bet, right? But it's already, a small bet is already starting to creep up. It's starting to exist, right? Whereas before on the, the 6 of diamonds, you see, we went from like 10 point something percent to 3 point something percent. So basically, guys, on the low cards, we still bet 3/4, but it's slightly less appealing. If it's a super scary card, like the super scary, 10 of diamonds, obviously you also would slow down, right? You see? So basically, if the card is like a flush card, which is a little bit scary, like a 6 or a 7 or a 9, whatever, we go 3/4. If it's a low card, we also go 3/4, but a bit less pleasant. If it's a very high card, we actually have to be most careful. I would still recommend this 3/4 pot size, but obviously, in this spot, it actually is not preferred. right? So be very careful. So guys, just because you are betting 3/4 pot does not mean we're betting only the nuts or nothing, right? We're still betting 60% of the time. Let's say we turn this into an MP versus big blind spot. Do you think we bet more often or less often? Okay, so the answer is probably slightly less often, but it's not really much of a difference. The point is here, if you look at the defending range for big blind, a lot of these combinations, right? A lot of these combinations completely miss the board. Whereas if you look at an MP versus big blind range, I actually have new pile because I crashed my PC a while ago. Whatever, I don't even have that range at the moment. But the point is, if you look at an MP versus big blind range, you'll see that range is completely different, right? Because that range doesn't really hit those low cards. The low cards don't really hit. You don't really defend a lot of those low cards anymore. So I mean, some of them, yes, but not, for instance, like deuce 3 suited, 4 deuce suited, right? Still like 8-5 and 8-6, 8-6, but not the really low stuff. All right, let's pick another board. So 10-9 deuce. I've run all of these spots for third pot as well as large, and obviously it didn't use any of those sizes, right? So again, you see always when it's around the pot size bet, you always see something like low fit, like, you know, in the 50s, right, in frequency. Not always, but in all three examples so far. So you kind of see the same thing, right? We bet large and like a medium frequency, and we do the same thing where the weaker the showdown value, the better the bluffing ability, the more we bluff, right? So you see hands like 8-7 and Queen Jack are great bluffs. We tend to bet them quite often, but then if we pick a hand that's a little bit weaker, we tend to bet a little bit less often, right? And we tend to bet with, you know, with a lot of hands that need value and protection here. So for instance, if you look at the 10x, right, always bet. Usually, sometimes, less often, less often, less often. So you generally, if you want to bet top pair, the better your kicker, the more you want to bet. Unless sometimes when you have really good backdoors, right? So for instance, with 10-8 and Jack 10, we also have good backdoors. It's one of the reasons we keep on betting. Whereas 10-7, 10-6 don't really have those backdoors much. So yeah, pretty interesting. And then once again, we see the same thing, right? On the deuce. I mean, if we look at 55, you see it actually folds a lot of deuces. You see it likes overbet. I mean, if we pick a 3, I mean, now it's even more obvious, right? So you see it loves overbet at high frequencies. You see how pure this bet is? Boom. You see how pure the bet is, right? And obviously in positions EV, I mean, it's 103. And he's got 61. So we've got almost 2/3 of the EV there. So obviously that's very, very powerful. So the point is, guys, we need to keep on barreling a lot. And so when you've got polarized ranges, you clearly see that putting in as much money as you can is super, super important. We've also, again, got some of these hands like Jack 10 that are maybe a slight overplay on the flop that always check turn, or Ace 9, mostly bet, right? And then we check, obviously, any turn. So that on the 9 turn, we're not screwed. You see, well, I actually didn't allow it to lead, but you see, you know, on the 9 turn, obviously, we're still betting large, 3/4. One of the reasons is that we did bet a lot of 9s still, or some of them. But obviously, we do check a lot. And so because we check a lot, guys, notice how Queen Jack gets checked a decent amount of the time. Notice how 8-7 gets checked a decent amount of the time. Everything checks a decent amount of the time. So figuring out your betting frequency is going to help you figure out how often a lot of the close hands get bet, right? So here, deuces obviously always get bet. Ace 9 obviously always gets bet. But then, like, you know, when it comes to jacks and whatnot, and you see here, jacks needing more protection than queens will be bet more often. And then a lot of the stuff that completely bricks, same thing. An ace would be interesting, actually. On an ace, we mostly bet 3/4. We know that an ace is not a big part of villain's range when he calls a pot size bet. So you see it bets mergey 3/4 pot, actually, which is pretty aggressive, right? Because if you look at our range, we're betting, you know, let's say a decent amount of aces, maybe like half of them, it looks like. Whereas if you look at his aces, I mean, look, almost none of them are calling. None of them are calling, right? Other than the ones with a pair, right? So we are betting maybe half our aces, and he's calling maybe like 20% of his aces. And then on, you know, like clean cards, like for instance, you know, the deuce and whatnot, we tend to use we either use a large sizing or an extremely large sizing. And you see it on all these blank runouts, we tend to just be quite aggressive. Call, 3, check, only overbet, of course. Overbet, not really much shoving. When it comes to shoving, the more draw heavy the board is, the more careful we are. Call, and then let's say we pick another deuce. And you see the only bet size again is all in, right? All of these hands want to shove. Even like King 10 wants to shove. It's super aggressive. I mean, basically, if you have King 10 plus, you're very happily shoving. So you have King 10, Ace 10, 10s, 9s, deuces, 3s, a deuce, all that type of stuff. So you have a ton of value bets, which means you also get to bluff a lot. And obviously do have a lot of bluffs. So now we pick another board, Ace King 3. So Ace King 3, you see we use a large bet size, and we're actually betting a little bit less than, somewhere in the 50s. That's because, protection on this board is a lot less important, right? There's no overcards out there at all, whereas on 10-9 deuce, there's 4 overcards out there. So what you clearly see is, again, the same thing, right? Kings always bet, 3s always bet. Ace King always bet, but aces do get checked, right? So basically, a couple of the strongest hands do get checked, and then you look at the strong hands, just the strong hands, Ace Queen, Ace Jack, Ace 10, mostly bet. Always, often, very often, less often, and to almost never. Same thing here, right? Other than Ace 3. With the king, it's even more obvious because, again, protection is not important on the king. On the previous board, if we go back to 10-9-8 for a sec, you see how many second pairs is betting right here. A lot. And here, some of them. Or same thing here. We're still betting a decent amount of them because Ace 9 needs so much protection. Whereas on the Ace King 3, obviously, your king needs virtually no protection, at least not from overcards. So you see basically always check and then occasionally bet King Queen, and that's it, right? Yeah. So, and then if you look at the bluffing hands, guys, under pairs obviously get bluffed, deuces, 4s, and then the higher the pair, the less often you bluff, right? You see? A lot, sometimes, never, right? And then you look at some Queen Jack, Jack 10 hands get bluffed. Jack 10 obviously more often because you have less showdown value than with Queen Jack. So Queen Jack and Queen 10 are kind of the same, obviously. And then what you also end up seeing, guys, one thing, you end up bluffing a lot with bottom pairs. Look at this, right? 4-3, Queen 3, King. Well, okay, those have 2 pairs. So I guess it's not relevant. But you see Queen 3, right? 100% bet, basically. Well, 98% bet. And the reason they get bet is on the flop, they get bet for a tiny bit of value and protection, but mostly because otherwise we don't find enough bluffs. It's really nice to bluff with hands that have no showdown value, realistic showdown value in a big pot, but block a lot of great hands, right? That was component number 2 when it comes to bluffing in big pots. You want to block your opponent's calling range. If we look at how it happens in an all-in spot. All in, right? All in. And look at the 3s, Ace 3, King 3, call. 3s, call, right? So basically, having a 3 in your hand as a blocker to your opponent's calls is very, very significant, right? Very, very significant. So blocking that is great. And so you see here, Queen 3 gets bluffed. 4-3 gets bluffed. Blocks King Queen. Blocks Ace 3. Right? Has a backdoor straight draw. So very, very relevant. And then obviously all the weaker stuff gets bluffed at a lower frequency. Now we pick a different board. 10 before it was 10-9 deuce. Now we pick 10-7 deuce, and you see actually the betting range is quite the same, right? So if you look for the hands to bet mixed on, it will mostly be the very draw heavy Broadway boards potentially, especially from earlier position, and then especially the boards that are 10 high, Jack high, and 9 high, sometimes even 8 high. Those are the boards you end up mixing most on because villain will defend a lot of hands like an 8, 9, and a 10 and a Jack, and he will have all the high straight draws and he will have all the low straight draws. So basically, he covers the whole spread of cards, right? Whereas if you look at The big cards, right? He cannot have any cards above the big cards, only below, and a lot of his range is below the big cards. So you see there you're obviously a lot far more ahead, right? So here, I mean, villain is defending a lot of, tens and sevens and everything below and everything above. Especially above is relevant. So you actually see this sim is quite similar to the 10-9 deuce board. And once again, so we see the same board, right? Jack high, Jack's important, 8's important, 5 not so much, but still, is relevant. And you see a lot of overcards out there, 3 overcards, a lot of straight draws out there, and a flush draw. So we would definitely like to size up. Okay. Yeah, we definitely like to size up, but we kind of do the same thing again, right? Well, when it comes to which hands to bet, the medium ones versus the strong ones, etc. And now the same thing would happen, right? So this board is obviously the least scary one of the last few ones we've discussed. So obviously check raising at a slightly higher frequency, call. Let's say like a 4, we end up overbetting, right? If it's like a 3, even better. You see even better, right? It's overbetting even more happily, only overbet. I would expect some shoves. Yeah, a little bit. Anyway, call, river deuce, check. And you see again, right? You see we're betting a polarized range on the flop. We're betting a polarized range on the turn. The river doesn't change. If anything, it changes in our favor when it comes to low pairs and ace-4, maybe 6-4. So you see we're shoving over pot very, very aggressively, 1.5 times the pot. We're shoving very aggressively, and even more so than 3/4 pot, right? Notice how aggressively we're shoving. We're shoving ace jack. We're shoving king jack, ace jack, jack 8, 8-5, 8s, 5s, 3s, deuces, 6-4, ace-4. 5-3. I didn't add to his range, but it would have shoved. It's so aggressive. The main point is, guys, making the pot huge. When you have a polarized range, which is looking very good, the board is safe and you're happy with your hand, bet large, okay? You want to get as much value as you can with those big hands, and obviously also as many folds as you can with the bluffs. And that's something that's a very common leak at low stakes and mid stakes, is that people just use too many of these medium sizes, right? I always hand why I don't like half pot. I don't like 2/3 pot. I don't like 40% pot on later streets. Because as you can tell right here, notice how it's going for large overbets all the time. It doesn't use these types of half pot bets almost at all. Obviously, I know that. I mean, basically, I sim them with all those sizes in there. It never uses them, and then I remove them, right? So polarization on later streets especially is very important in spots where you've got a lot of very, very good hands and also a lot of bad ones. All right, guys, I think we'll wrap it up then. If you have any sims you were running on the side, whatever you like, post it. If you have any questions later, don't be afraid to ask. So, bye, guys.